Welcome back to the realm, lords and ladies. I am the Goat King. The last video I did for Pathfinder 2nd edition was about a homebrew rule I had made for social combat. I called it Dynamic Diplomacy. Imagine my frustration when shortly before that video went live, I got to read my new copy of the Gamemastery guide, only to find out that there are several subsystems built specifically for social and diplomatic interactions in Pathfinder 2nd edition. Before we get into this, I want to be clear, I'm probably biased towards the homebrew rule I created, but I do want to take a look at the various social subsystems within the Gamemastery guide and see if maybe one of those will make dynamic diplomacy utterly irrelevant. Before we can decide if something makes dynamic diplomacy irrelevant, we need to have an idea of what dynamic diplomacy was meant to do. Dynamic diplomacy had three basic goals. One was to introduce conversation-like elements from the real world into the game. Two, it was meant to be fairly simple and lightweight to use and incorporate into your game. And three, all of this was meant to create a gameplay mode that emphasized conversations and diplomacy. There are four subsystems I want to touch on, being the victory point subsystem, the reputation subsystem, the leader subsystem, and finally the influence subsystem. The victory point subsystem is very simple and has a broad range of applications, including that it can be used to adjudicate both small and large conversational and diplomatic situations. It's a very simple system with broad application. Because of this, it doesn't have any support for specific situations. It doesn't have anything written out for that, so you'll be creating a lot of this on your own as the game master, using victory points as a guide and framework. Reputation, the next system we'll be going over, is quite simple, and it was built to allow a party to interact with a large group or organization over the course of significant periods of time. While this is a very useful subsystem in any long-running game, it doesn't tread the same ground as dynamic diplomacy. The leadership system is a reverse of the reputation system, being that instead of the party interacting with a large group or organization, the party may run a large group or organization. For the same reasons, the reputation subsystem doesn't interact on the scale that the dynamic diplomacy homebrew rule does. The same applies here to the leadership subsystem. It's fantastic for long-running games and dealing with big groups, but it doesn't get down to the conversational rules. Finally, we have the influence subsystem. This subsystem is simple, and it states a clear mode of play for conversations, and honestly, this is the biggest threat to the dynamic diplomacy homebrew rule. While both dynamic diplomacy and influence allow for conversations in-game to be adjudicated by more interesting rules, influence is definitely the simpler of the two, while dynamic diplomacy dives into the nitty-gritty of conversation and tone. Of course, influence works better for having a group of people interacting with an NPC rather than where with dynamic diplomacy, it is certainly more focused on one player and one NPC. I don't believe dynamic diplomacy is irrelevant, even though influence does tread the same ground and adjudicate the same situations. Preference for faster and easier gameplay will definitely favor the influence subsystem, while preference for more true-to-life socialization will favor the dynamic diplomacy homebrew rule. Most of what I heard about the Gamemastery guide from the community has been focused on the free archetype and proficiency without level optional rules. I hadn't actually heard much about the social subsystems. Because of that, I plan to make in-depth videos about reputation, leadership, and influence. A friend of mine, the local disaster tour guide, briefly covered victory points in his recent video on social encounters. Link in the description. Thank you again for visiting the realm. I've been the Goat King. Come back again next week for more Pathfinder and Starfinder.